Messerschmitt Me-109 in Swiss Air Force service. This will be a fun one.
Now I know what you might be wondering at this point. How did this, the Bf-109, essentially Germany's premier fighter during World War II, end up in the hands of the Swiss, a neutral country? And did it in fact shoot down German aircraft during World War II? I'm gonna be answering this question and many more in the upcoming video. Let's put that there. Hello everybody and welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm your host Bismarck and today we're going to talk about the Swiss Air Force during World War II. Now as you can imagine, being in World War II as a Swiss is quite an interesting time. You are part of a neutral country, you don't have any friends, you don't have any enemies, and you're trying to survive in a conflict that spawned the globe for over 6 years. Now for the Swiss Air Force this is quite an interesting time as well. Compared to their neighbors, Germany, France and Italy, they are completely out of date and they lack modern material and equipment. How are they going to survive in any kind of battle that could unfold should one of the countries that neighbors it choose to invade little Switzerland? After all, the Air Force will be the first line of defense and protect Switzerland from any kind of aerial attack. Now to illustrate the point that the Swiss Air Force wasn't really prepared at this point, let's look at their order of battle of 1949. Before we talk about the planes of the Swiss Air Force, let's talk about its organization very quickly. The largest unit was the Flieger-Regiment, which was usually divided into 2 or 3 Fliegerabteilungen, and each Abteilung was further divided into 3 Fliegerkompanien. These would usually be 2 recon kompanien and 1 fighter company. Now if we look at the map of Switzerland and the distribution of these regiments and Abteilungen, we'll see something quite interesting. The first Flieger-Regiment was stationed next to Bern, the capital. The second one was near Murten, which is also relatively close to the capital of Switzerland, and the supporting airfields are indicated as you can see. And the third Flieger-Regiment was next to Dübendorf to the north. And this really places the focus of the Swiss Air Force to the northern border next to essentially what would be France and Germany and not Italy, which is quite an interesting development right there. Okay, so let's talk about the planes that the Swiss had in 1939. The first one here is the Fokker C-5. This is actually a Dutch plane used as a recon and light attack aircraft. The Swiss had 27 of these in 1949 that were operational. These planes were exported to many countries and were very versatile. They could also carry bombs, but as you'll notice with all of these aircraft, the Swiss actually demounted the original armament and mounted their own. Alright, with that aircraft done, let's have a look at the KWC-35. This was a reconnaissance aircraft but also used in a light attack role. This is actually a really fun aircraft in my opinion. It's a 2-seat recon aircraft built to replace the earlier Fokker and was delivered in 1938. Now it had actually quite a heavy armament for a biplane. It had a central mounted 20mm cannon which made it quite spectacular on the offensive. But as a biplane, of course, it was outdated by World War II standards. Coming up then is the mainstay fighter of the Swiss before this time, Devotin D-27. This is a parasol monoplane fighter. Now parasol essentially means that the top wing is held above the fuselage. It's like a biplane without the lower wing. This is an outdated design introduced in 1931 and really wouldn't have held up in modern combat. However, it did help the Devotin company to survive during the interwar years. Next up, the Bf-109D. Now we're getting a little bit modern here. This is of course the earlier version of the Bf-109 and it's not really that powerful compared to the new models, the Emils, but it's the first time the Swiss actually get their hands on a relatively modern aircraft, and of course they are using it as a mainstay fighter as well. However, they only have 6 of these at this point. Then we move on to the Bf-109E3. This really is the creme de la creme of the time. And it's a big step up from the earlier Dora variant, powerful, heavily armed and very, very modern. And actually the Swiss are quite lucky of getting these aircraft. They didn't have a lot in 1939 with only 12 operational. And as you can see, once again, they also changed the weaponry on this aircraft. But it's actually remarkable that these planes were sent to Switzerland. Now, even though a lot of the fighting in 1939 is nowhere near Switzerland, its airspace is being reached 143 times. 15 times by French, 52 times by German, and 76 times by unknown aircraft. The Swiss are, naturally, not happy about this. And they start mounting patrol flights in the last days of September of that year to catch these intruders. This only lasts for 3 days because the Swiss border brigades themselves tell the Swiss Air Force to stand down and only fly when they're being asked to. For the Swiss Air Force, this is also a time of modernization. There are still imports coming in from Germany with brand new Bf 109 E3s, essentially the plane you see right there. And this process lasts until April 1940 when these 50 aircrafts are being sent. At the same time, Switzerland makes a deal with France and is now allowed to license build a French fighter, the MS-406. Now the Morane-Solier 406 or MS-406 is an interesting aircraft. It is not exactly a bad performer, but when it comes down to it, it just doesn't make the cut and certainly is outperformed by some of the more modern aircraft to come out the production lines during that time. However, it does give Switzerland a little bit of independence from German imports as they are able to license produce these French aircraft. Now in 1940, things change radically. In March of that year, the first RAF bomber intrudes on Swiss airspace, and a month after that, the Swiss Air Force and the AA units are given a significant order. They're being told to indiscriminately shoot at anything that comes across the border, whether it's a fighter, a bomber, or a butterfly. Shoot first, ask questions later is very much the mantra right there. And the month following that, in May 1940, Swiss Bf 109s for the first time meet a German aircraft. It's a Heinkel 111P. And this is of course an early bomber variant of the famous German medium bomber. This bomber makes it back to German territory just fine, but 6 days later another bomber, again a Heinkel 111P, isn't that lucky. And two Bf 109Es from the Swiss Air Force shoot this bomber down. Now this is quite a significant turn of events. And you might now wonder, how come this bomber actually strayed into Swiss airspace? Well, this bomber was from KG 27, Kampfgeschwader 27, which is one of the bomber wings that the Germans had. And its target that day was Paris. Yeah, and if you know your geography, you'll know that Paris is quite a ways away from Switzerland. So how did this mistake occur? Well, technical problems, human error, clouds and navigational errors. You can make quite a list of how a bomber might lose its way during that time. Now, it's of course a tragic incident, but it's quite remarkable that in May 1940, 113 intrusions are made into Swiss airspace, mostly by unknown aircraft. So if you paid attention early on, you'll realize that in 1939, in total 143 intrusions were made, but in 1 month alone in 1940, that number was nearly met. And this is really a sign of things to come. Now in June, things start getting really serious. On the first day of that month, Swiss Bf 109 intercept a couple of Heinkel 111s and shoot 2 of them down. On the 2nd of June, an additional Heinkel 111 shares their fate. And on the 4th, 2 Bf 110s are also claimed. Now the Germans at this point are fuming and maintain that all planes were in fact intercepted outside of Swiss airspace. The Swiss on their side of course say that no, these interceptions were done in our own airspace and the Germans were at fault for violating it. However, even back then no one knew for sure because the borders in that region are very much hard to pinpoint from, well, 2,000 or 3,000 meters up. For example, when the Bf 110s went down, they actually crashed into French territory, and this further complicated matters. Now the Germans demand an apology and reparations, so on the 8th of June a committee is set up. On one hand side is Switzerland, on the other hand side is Germany, and then there's a neutral chair, Italy. Well, as neutral as can be. The Swiss argue that they only maintain their neutrality, while the Germans say, well, if our planes get lost, just show them the way out. As talks commence, a Swiss delegate gets a phone call and he's being told that the Swiss Air Force just shot down 4 additional German machines and lost one of their own. As it turns out, on this day, the Luftwaffe deliberately violated Swiss airspace, trying to get revenge. That kind of backfired. However, Swiss Bundespräsident Pellier talks with General Golson. Without Germany placing any demands, he called the German emissary to tell him that he had instructed General Golson to call upon his pilots to exercise restraint in those instances where violation of Swiss airspace was an excusable mistake. This is reinforced later on the 13th by Golson himself, who tells his ground observers to not call in inconsequential airspace violations. But the situation was still not resolved, as there was one person in Germany who was really angry and wanted his revenge on the Swiss. And to tell us all about that, we have BLOKE on the range in Switzerland.
So Hermann Göring considered it a massive insult to German pride that the tiny Swiss had been shooting down his mighty Luftwaffe's aircraft, so he planned an act of revenge. In Berlin, a group of 10 saboteurs, including 8 Germans and 2 Swiss nationals resident in Germany, were given explosives and instructions to infiltrate illegally into Switzerland via various border routes on the night of the 13th to the 14th of June 1940. The plan was that on the evening of the 16th of June, they were going to attack various Swiss airfields, including this one here at Thun, and the federal ammunition plant in Altdorf. Now, luckily, all of the people were picked up before they could carry out their acts, and what actually happened was that a Swiss train driver at the railway station in Singen noticed a group of Germans, and it's very obvious when people are German, when your ear is tuned into to Swiss people speaking Swiss German, carrying rucksacks and wearing inappropriate footwear, so street shoes, which don't really go with big rucksacks. He thought that was suspicious. He alerted the local picket officer, who alerted the border guards and the airfield guards, and the men were picked up. They were all put on trial. The press were muzzled, but news leaked out. And the Germans, of course, denied all knowledge, as you would, because it was kind of embarrassing. But the Swiss federal president presented the German ambassador with information on the men, who they were, what their mission was, the fact they'd been instructed in Berlin, the fact that the explosives were German, and the fact that 6 of them were in the Wehrmacht and acting under orders. So from that point on, the Germans didn't comment. It was all very embarrassing. And on the 16th of November 1940, all 10 men were sentenced to life imprisonment. And it was only at this point that the Germans showed any interest in their people at all and visited them in prison.
Now, considering this incident, you'd expect there to be some sort of repercussions. However, if you go through the source material, I have Swiss historian Bonjour here, you'll see that next to a frantic diplomatic to and fro, not much happens. By the way, if you're interested, all my sources to all my videos are always linked in the description below, so check it out. Now, how does this situation actually resolve? Well, it's actually quite easy. Now, the Swiss at this point just want the situation to be resolved and to blow over. And they're gambling for time, hoping perhaps that something will pique the interest of the Germans somewhere else, maybe somewhere with France or Great Britain, and that, you know, they will shift their attention somewhere else where it doesn't bother the Swiss. And likewise, the Germans actually want the situation to be resolved as well, because they didn't really have some kind of nefarious end goal in mind. This situation occurred because bombers got lost and then shot down by the Swiss. And it kind of snowballed from there. And yes, the actions of certain individuals like Göring didn't really help, but there was no end goal in mind. There was nothing that politically was to be gained from this situation, at least nothing the Germans had planned at this point. So when the Swiss made an offer, the Germans essentially accepted it. And this offer came in 2 stages. On the one hand side, there was a gesture of good faith from the Swiss. And they released 17 out of 19 Luftwaffe crew members they had interned. 2 were simply too injured to travel. And on the other hand, they said, yes, we will pay for any kind of German aircraft that was shot down by the Swiss if it's proven that it was not shot down over Swiss territory. Now, proving this would be a really long-winded process. And when the Germans got this offer, they essentially declined, but at the same time they saw it as a sort of apology. And having saved face at this point, they said, oh, yeah, okay, well, this situation, we shall consider it resolved for now. One of the things that keeps nagging them is the fact that until now, the Swiss only have targeted Luftwaffe aircraft. They never have really shot down anything from, for example, the French. So they always have in the back of their mind this feeling that the Swiss one side here, and that they are closer to the Allies than, you know, neutrality would stipulate. And this is something that will recur in the coming years as well, an accusation that the Germans will keep on doing. But for now, they're happy to have the situation resolved. Now, the Swiss Air Force at this point is effectively grounded, and this incident, the bombers they shot down, the Bf-110s, and the whole Göring affair, really is one of the reasons why this happens. But however, there's also a couple of more reasons. First of all, the spare part problems. They want to really make sure that the aircraft don't get damaged or destroyed in accidents or in contact with enemy air forces. But there's one other thing that I find quite interesting. This is something that I found in Georg Hoch's book here. And that is the oil situation for Switzerland. Now, not everything comes down to oil, but it's quite interesting that, you know, Switzerland, of course, as a small nation, was reliant on foreign oil imports and fuel imports. And while they started getting into the game of synthesized oils and so on and so forth, even by 1944, they only had enough aviation fuel for 20 days of operation. And this is actually quite a good situation for Switzerland in 1944. So to save a little bit fuel at this point and to make sure that you have a couple of tactical reserves in your stockpile is actually not a bad thing indeed. Now, if at this point you were hoping for poor Switzerland to get some respite, then I have some bad news for you. You see, in June, Italy enters the war, which means that the RAF is now going to fly strikes against the northern part of Italy. And they have three paths to choose from. They either go over occupied France and hit Italy from the northwest, or they go over the Reich and what used to be Austria and hit Italy from the northeast, or they go the direct path over Switzerland, saving them time, fuel, and also putting the aircraft out of harm's way from the Luftwaffe and the Regina Aeronautica, which is the Italian Air Force. Now, it's not sure how much the RAF actually endorsed this. They certainly told their pilots not to do it, but when their pilots did it, they kind of shrugged it off. Now, the Swiss complained bitterly to Her Majesty's government, and Her Majesty's government was actually responsive to them to a degree, telling them, yeah, well, we're trying our best to have our bomber boys stop this practice, but once they're in the air, we can't really do anything. When we're trying to explain to them that they shouldn't breach the neutrality of Switzerland, but hey, once up there, they are master and commander. So, what really happens at this point? Well, a couple of tragic incidents. For example, already in June, the RAF for the first time bombs Swiss territory, by mistake, I might add. Britain does take responsibility, pays 1.2 million francs in damages. And also in December of that year, the RAF hits Basel, quite a sizable town for Swiss standards. And 2 months later, again, the RAF does take responsibility for this. And throughout August, September, November, December, more than 250 airspace violations are made by Britain. And Germany at this point turns around to Switzerland and says, hey, wait a second, we didn't fly that many airspace violations and you shot down a sizable number of our aircraft. How come none of the Brits have been shot down yet? And it's true, the Swiss have not claimed a single British RAF kill. So, what's the problem? Well, on the one hand side, obviously, the Air Force is grounded. On the other hand, Switzerland doesn't have any night fighters and all the RAF missions are done by night. And then, well, the flak units. They could potentially counter the RAF at night, but they're completely underdeveloped. And this is actually quite interesting because at this point, even though it looked like Switzerland a couple of months ago would have been pushed into the Allied camp with the crisis that was unfolding with Germany, now they're looking to Germany and say, hey, can you guys maybe help us develop our flak units, our AA units? Would that be possible? We hear great things about your guys. And Germany is not quite sure what they should do, and the situation kind of fizzles out. But it's interesting how quickly Switzerland has to reorientate itself away from the Allies towards Germany in order to keep that neutrality. You know, this game of to and fro and this jumping, this political jiggle, really is something that is, you know, a standard throughout the war for Italy, and it makes actually quite an interesting case study. Anyway, there's one more humorous thing I would like to add to this situation. You see, on the 13th of November, one of my favorite trivia moments from the early war period occurs, and this is a lone Dornier Do-17, a flying cigar as they call it, crashing into the Swiss mountainside, taking with it 120 pine trees. Yes, the Swiss are good at counting, and yes, they're good at taking records. Well done from Germany. Now you might ask the questions, as did the Swiss, what the hell, where is this bomber coming from? And the crew is completely unaccounted for. It's not with the wreck, it hasn't bailed out over Switzerland, so the Swiss wouldn't get the answer for many, many years, but we obviously have it for you now. You see, this bomber at that day was bombing England, and on its return way, its control rods got damaged and shredded. It was still going in a straight line, but it was essentially out of control, so the crew decided to abandon ship over France to save themselves, and they waved goodbye to the bomber as it was going into the horizon, just going and going and going, and eventually running out of fuel, crashing into Switzerland. So yeah, for the Swiss this was quite a head scratcher, but yeah, it's resolved now. Anyway, with 1940 done, let's go into 1941 and let's talk a little bit about the Swiss AA units at this time. Similar to the Germans with the word flak, the Swiss have constructed a word meaning AAA, which is flap. This is a term constructed out of the word Flieger and Abwehr, aircraft defense. However, the Swiss also use French and Italian as an official language, and the abbreviation would be DCA, Défense contre Avion, and Difesa contra Aerea. The Swiss have quite a diverse range of guns for AA defense, featuring both heavy, medium, and of course light AA, mainly composed out of the famous Oerlikon 20mm cannon. At the start of the war, the Swiss only have 12 heavy AA guns. However, their arsenal will be expanded to roughly 200 of these guns. The 7.5 cm AA gun is of French origin, and while it is probably not the equivalent of some of the other guns during the time, it does give the Swiss a method of engaging high-flying bombers. The 34mm Flakkanon 38 is probably the ugly duckling in the lineup. It's not a very successful design, and the Swiss will only acquire roughly 200 of these, using them mainly for point defense around airfields and important areas. Whereas this design was probably not as successful, the Swiss have an excellent AA gun with the 20mm Flakkanon 38. This will be continuously upgraded throughout World War II, and the Swiss will eventually acquire more than 2,000 of these. But however, they are not the only ones. This gun is used by all sides throughout World War II. Now, on the whole, 1941 would prove to be actually quite a calm year for the Swiss. Yes, there are still RAF bombers that cross over their territory, and yes, sometimes German cadets get lost in the border regions and they land out of fuel on a Swiss airfield, and the Swiss usually give them a complimentary top-up and allow them to return to the fatherland the next day. But in 1942, things are starting to heat up again. You see, the RAF at this point was also sometimes, at least, overflying Swiss territory by day, which should give the AA units, remember the Air Force is still grounded, but the AA units should at this point at least have a better chance of scoring a kill. But they don't. However, the German flak units and the Italian AA units on the border regions to Switzerland sometimes do claim kills. So they turn around to Switzerland and say, look, we're shooting stuff down in the geographical region. How can't you do the same? Are you not putting enough lead into the sky? Are you playing favorites at this point? And there is sort of this morbid wish in Switzerland, especially among the army and the politicians, of at least claiming one RAF kill, of at least shooting something down, lighting the sky on fire and trying to get that one bomber so they can turn around to the Germans and show a wreckage and say, look, we got one, we're not playing sides here. But all they get in 1942 is actually a lost Mosquito. It runs out of fuel over Switzerland and has to land there. That's the only thing they have to show for. However, in 1942, another aircraft is introduced into the Swiss Air Force, and I personally find this actually to be one of my favorite aircraft, obscure aircraft for that time period. It's really an interesting design, so let's have a better look at the C-3603. The C-3603 is a recon fighter and close air support aircraft and a homegrown design. And with this aircraft, the Swiss Air Force has a multiple-purpose aircraft featuring both offensive and defensive firepower with a diverse bomb loadout. However, overall, it is once again a little bit behind the curve when it comes to its performance, although it will survive into the Cold War period, mainly being used as a target at that point. The aircraft I introduced thus far are of course the combat machines, but there's another dimension to military aviation that is very important, that is the trainers. Yes, they're not as shiny, yes, they don't go boom boom boom, but they are the craft that allow the pilots to gain the necessary skills to then take the fight to the enemy. And this summer we were actually fortunate enough to go to Switzerland and film inside an authentic Bf 108, the aircraft that the Swiss used to train their Bf 109 fighter pilots during World War II. We made a complete inside and outside episode, you can find it down in the description below. I'd like to thank my patrons for funding this trip, and of course also thank Elliot and Ampati Association that takes care of this aircraft. If you like this video, if you like my plane inside out videos, please consider supporting the channel. Your contribution helps us make this kind of content. You can also gain some nice perks with it, and you can find the link to that in the description and over here. Going into 1943, the Swiss start claiming their first kills on Allied aircraft. The Air Force is still grounded until October, when it was once again released into the sky. But the AA units claim their first kills in July, when 2 Lancasters are shot down. And in October of that year, an American B-17 follows. Now, the Allies are ramping up their bombing effort considerably, and they are not just coming from the United Kingdom at this point, they're also coming from bases in Africa, flying from the south to the north into the Reich. And at this point, they're of course passing Switzerland. because just like earlier in 1940 and 1941, it's the more direct route and it's the safer route. They're not supposed to do this, of course, but you try telling that to a crew that has to brave German flag and Luftwaffe on a mission-to-mission basis. But while the total number of airspace violations will increase incrementally throughout the war, they still only represent a tiny fraction of the total missions sent against the Reich. But for Switzerland, this tiny fraction is quite enough. As an example, by the summer of 1944, more than 100 Allied bombers will have landed in Switzerland with their crews interned, and this number will actually go up to 160 by the end of the war. Amongst Swiss pilots, it is in fact joked that should you take off, you will probably be doomed to fly on forever, because by the time you come back, your parking space will have been taken up by an American bomber. But all jokes aside, there is actually quite a significant study that was made on the motivation of the bomber pilots to actually land in Switzerland. And it turned out, as the US Army Air Force tells us, that in more than 50% of these cases, the bombers were so damaged that by the time they landed, they would probably not have been repairable in the first place. So for many of these crews, this was the only way to avoid German captivity. But the bomber stream that went to and fro Switzerland also had a tragic connotation, and for that we turn back to Switzerland and BLOKE on the range, who will tell us more about it.
Now, there were in fact numerous incidents of Allied bombs falling on Swiss territory dating right back to the start of the war. Typically early on it was the RAF either misidentifying a target or a lone damaged aircraft straying into Swiss territory and jettisoning its bombs to save weight. But the single largest incident of its kind was on the 1st of April 1944, when a group of American B-24 Liberator bombers dropped 371 bombs on the town of Schaffhausen. Now, Schaffhausen is the only Swiss city north of the Rhine, and it's sort of situated almost sticking out into Germany. And so there'd been a lot of aircraft alarms during the war, something like 500 up to that point, and the population had become used to it. And instead of seeking cover, they'd come out and look up at the sky, see if they could spot the bombers. Only this time, the American crews thought they had Ludwigshafen in Germany in their sights, but they didn't. They had Schaffhausen. And in 40 seconds of bombing, 37 people were killed outright, hundreds wounded, and 300 bombed out of their homes. Now, cynics alleged that the bombing was in fact deliberately targeting the SIG arms plant in Neuhausen, which is right next door, because they were allegedly selling arms to the Germans. But in fact, in one of the few court-martial incidents of bombing of neutral territory, it was determined that it was just sheer navigational failure. And they court-martialed the lead aircraft and determined that no, it was just a massive screw up. And you've got to remember, in the days before GPS and modern navigational aids, it was mostly dead reckoning. This could be problematic in case of cloud or unexpected windiness. And the few electronic aids they had were easily jammed by the Germans. So it was quite possible to be significantly off course. And this court-martial determined that yes, this was in fact the case. Now, as was the usual case when the culprits of a bombing of Swiss territory could be determined, the Americans paid a substantial amount of compensation. An initial payment of $1 million, if I remember correctly, and $4 million total seems to have been paid. But the figures cited in various sources vary quite a lot.
There's a few more things that happened in 1944, including a very humiliating moment for the Luftwaffe. But before that, it deserves mentioning that Swiss Bf 109s actually shot down a B-17 in this year as well, and a P-47, and I wonder whether this was immortalized here in the cover. One other thing that happens is that the Swiss terminate their blackout policy in September of that year, hoping that Allied bombers that come at night will see a brightly lit territory and then they will know, aha, this is Switzerland, let's not drop our bombs here. Early on in the war, they had already experimented with the same policy and there were no conclusive results, so I'm wondering how much it helped. But hey, if it did, then that's great. Now let's talk about the Luftwaffe in that humiliating moment. On the night of the 28th to the 29th of April, two German Bf 110 G4s get lost over Switzerland. They come from Nachtjagdgeschwader 5, Night Fighter Unit 5, and on board they carry a unique piece of equipment, the SN2 Lichtenstein radar. This is a new gizmo that the Germans use to hunt down Allied bombers at night, and it is so new and so powerful and so secret that the Germans treat it as a national treasure. And when one of these 110s fails to return, they realize it has landed in neutral Switzerland. And not only does it have the Lichtenstein radar on board, but one of its occupants, a Lieutenant Kampaf, had with him codes and maps that he was never supposed to take on the flight. So the Germans pretty much soiled their collective pants. Because they realized that now at this point the Swiss could essentially turn around to the Allies and say, hey, we found something here you might be interested in. Can you make us an offer? And so they lean on Switzerland to return this aircraft. And the Swiss essentially say no, because we also don't return Allied aircraft to the Allies, we shouldn't be returning this aircraft to you either. We can send you the crew perhaps, but the aircraft will stay with us. And one of the crew members, actually the pilot, Oberleutnant Jonen, would by the end of the war have 34 kills to his name, so he wasn't exactly inexperienced. This was just a freak accident. The Germans realized the predicament they're in, and at some point they're even thinking about sending commandos over to Switzerland to blow up this aircraft. But they probably remember how a similar situation ended 4 years prior, so they go for a more diplomatic approach. They turn around to Switzerland and say, by the way, you're not still using that really old aircraft. What was it, the 109E3? Oh, we've completely forgotten about that one. We have a much better aircraft now. It's called the 109G6. Would you like some? And the Swiss say, we will take 12. So they buy them for 500,000 francs each, making the sole sale price 6 million. In return, the Germans are allowed to send a small delegation to Switzerland, and the Swiss army, in the presence of this delegation, will blow up the 110 on the night of the 18th to the 19th of May. For the Swiss, this crisis somewhat ended in a plus. Now the G6 in Swiss military service is actually quite interesting, so let's have a quick look at that. The G6 was the most produced variant of the Bf 109. The Swiss noticed that there was very little standardization between the aircraft they actually received, pointing to the fact that they were produced in different factories throughout Germany. The Swiss had an unhappy relationship with the G6s they received, as these were apparently plagued with technical and mechanical deficiencies. The G6s they had received are still of the older kind, equipped with a 20mm cannon instead of a 30mm. This armament was retained by the Swiss and they received ammunition from the Germans. Due to numerous accidents, the Swiss eventually grounded their G6s, at which point they resorted back to their E3s for their standard patrols. Going into 1945, the Luftwaffe of course still admits death by Bodenplatte, and its resistance is shattered henceforth. Germany itself, however, will continue to fight until May of that year. For the Swiss, the number of airspace violations is actually going down for the first 2 months of that year, but it will once again go up in March and in April, bringing a grand total of 650 airspace violations for 1945 alone. Much of this has to do with the fact that the German resistance at the end of the war is centered, of course, around Berlin, but also the south of Germany, where the Luftwaffe, what is left of it, still has quite a few bases left. Now, when we look at the number of planes that actually land in Switzerland, we see something quite interesting. First of all, there's roughly 20 American bombers that land again, but there's also the curious case of a Hungarian plane and a French Spitfire, well, a Spitfire piloted by a French pilot. But then at the very end of the war, at the end of April and the beginning of May, we see the string of German aircraft landing in Switzerland. Most of these are trainer aircraft that the Luftwaffe has, Bücker Bestmanns, Me-108s and all that good stuff. And then we also have a Fiesler Storch, which is actually the last plane that lands in Switzerland. And we actually have an episode on that aircraft as well, so check it out. And then we have a Ju-88, that's a bomber, and an Me-262. So the Swiss actually get a jet, which they are obviously very curious to check out. There's also that interesting case of a Soviet Yak-9 landing and the pilot essentially jumping out requesting for asylum. The Swiss don't take it because they fear sort of the political repercussions that might happen here. So apparently this pilot actually has to be sedated, so he gives up his resistance and then he's sent back to the Soviets. What exactly happens to him, I don't know. But for Switzerland, the grand tally of World War II, a war they were not really involved in, is quite staggering. Throughout World War II, the air raid sirens will sound 7,400 times in Switzerland. 23 foreign bombers will crash land on Swiss soil. As a result, 40 crew members lose their life. The number of intern crew members goes up to 1,620 as a result of their aircraft landing in Switzerland. But the Swiss have their own casualties, 82 dead and 260 wounded as a result of these airspace violations. And you might say, that is not much considering the scale of World War II, but for a neutral country, every loss is a tragic one. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, share it with your friends, share it on social media, just go wild with it. Check out the description below for helpful links and my Patreon if you want to support the channel. And as always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.